The grotesque deformity stared back from the portrait, a jaw so severely protruded that basic functions like chewing became impossible. The man in the painting was no commoner suffering misfortune, but Charles II of Spain, heir to the most powerful dynasty in Europe. What horrifying family secret transformed a royal bloodline into a genetic nightmare? When we imagine royalty, we picture glamorous crowns and opulent palaces. What you don't learn in history class is that behind those palace walls lurked a biological horror show created by centuries of the most extreme inbreeding in human history. The thrones of Europe weren't passed down. They were recycled within a grotesquely shrinking pool of DNA. The Habsburg dynasty ruled over much of Europe for centuries, controlling an empire where the sun never set. Their strategy for maintaining power? Keep it in the family, literally. The family tree of the Habsburgs doesn't branch out. It circles back on itself repeatedly in a genetic death spiral. By the time Charles II was born in 1661, his family's DNA had become a twisted wreckage. His family tree should have contained 32 different individuals in the previous 5 generations. Instead, it contained only 10 unique people. Charles's parents, Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. But that barely scratches the surface of this genetic catastrophe. Charles's mother was simultaneously his first cousin once removed, and his first cousin twice removed. His grandmother was also his aunt. His inbreeding coefficient was worse than if his parents had been brother and sister, a staggering 0.25, meaning 25% of his genes contained identical alleles received from both parents. The physical consequences were immediate and horrifying. Court documents describe a child so deformed at birth that rumors spread he was actually a changeling or demon. Charles couldn't speak until age 4 or walk until age 8. His tongue was so oversized for his deformed mouth that he constantly drooled, creating a permanent wet stain on his clothes that courtiers pretended not to notice. His Habsburg jaw, the infamous prognatism that plagued the dynasty, reached its grotesque crescendo in Charles. The deformity was so severe that his top and bottom teeth couldn't meet, making it nearly impossible to chew food. Royal physicians had to pre-masticate his meals or serve only soft foods that required minimal chewing. But the jaw was merely the visible manifestation of far deeper horrors. Medical historians analyzing contemporary accounts believe Charles suffered from combined pituitary hormone deficiency, renal tubular acidosis, and 2 different rare genetic disorders simultaneously, a statistical impossibility unless massive inbreeding had occurred. The psychological torture this inflicted on the young king is impossible to fully comprehend. Court records describe episodes where Charles would suddenly drop to all fours and begin barking and growling like a dog. During diplomatic meetings, he would sit motionless and silent for hours, drooling uncontrollably before suddenly shrieking unintelligible sounds that sent foreign ambassadors fleeing in terror. Perhaps most disturbing was his repeated inability to control his bowels in public settings. Royal attendants developed elaborate systems to quickly remove and replace soiled clothing without acknowledging what had happened. Imagine living your entire life where everyone pretends not to notice your most humiliating moments. By his 20s, Charles's physical deterioration accelerated at a horrifying pace. His autopsy report, only recently translated in full, reveals details too gruesome for conventional history books. His heart was described as the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines gangrenous, his kidneys filled with watery blood, and perhaps most shockingly, when they opened his skull, they found not a single drop of blood in his brain, which itself was the size of a small animal's. The royal physicians declared, in writing, that the king's body contained not a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. Yet somehow, despite this catalog of medical horrors, Charles II remained alive for 39 years, each day a waking nightmare of physical suffering and cognitive confusion. The man who ruled over a global empire could barely string together a coherent sentence. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Charles's existence wasn't his personal suffering. It was the desperate attempts to force him to reproduce. Despite his obvious deformities and disabilities, the royal court was obsessed with obtaining an heir. Charles was married twice, with both queens subjected to humiliating fertility rituals and public scrutiny of their menstrual cycles. The royal bedchamber became a site of grotesque medical experimentation. Court physicians prescribed potions containing crushed stag antlers, powdered human skulls, and various animal testicles, all forced down the reluctant king's malformed throat. When these failed, they resorted to more invasive measures, including primitive hormonal treatments derived from animal glands that cause violent vomiting and seizures. Both queens endured equally horrific treatments, from vaginal fumigations with toxic herbs to the insertion of various substances believed to increase fertility. These painful and dangerous procedures continued for years, all while courtiers and foreign spies literally monitored the royal bedchamber, sometimes hiding behind curtains to report whether consummation had occurred. The psychological torture this created cannot be overstated. Imagine being physically and mentally disabled, then having your most intimate moments scrutinized by an entire continent, with the future of an empire resting on your ability to perform sexually despite your numerous conditions. What's rarely discussed is that Charles almost certainly knew he was the product of inbreeding. Court records show he possessed enough lucidity to understand the whispers about his appearance and the jokes made at his expense. In one heartbreaking letter to his first wife, he apologizes for the burden of my company and acknowledges the disappointment I must be to all who gaze upon me. As his condition deteriorated, a more sinister evidence of his awareness emerged. Palace records document Charles ordering all mirrors and reflective surfaces removed from his chambers, unable to bear the sight of his own reflection. Portraits were specifically commissioned to minimize his deformities, creating an alternate reality that existed only on canvas. The most shocking revelation comes from Charles's autopsy. When physicians examined his reproductive organs, they discovered he was effectively sterile. His single atrophied testicle could never produce viable sperm. The decades of painful fertility treatments, the public humiliation, the continental anxiety over succession, all based on a biological impossibility. As Charles approached death, the Habsburg genetic catastrophe reached its logical conclusion. His body began to shut down system by system. His final days, as documented by his personal physician, are a horror show of symptoms. His body swelled with fluid until his skin began to split open. His internal organs failed simultaneously. He could no longer digest food and vomited fecal matter. In his final moments, he reportedly begged to be put out of his misery. Charles II died on November 1st, 1700, ending not just his life of suffering, but the entire Spanish Habsburg line. A dynasty that had ruled over much of the known world for centuries was extinguished by its own obsession with blood purity. The political consequences were immediate and devastating. Charles's death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a global conflict that killed over 1 million people, all because a family refused to marry outside their increasingly narrow circle. The Habsburg story serves as nature's most vivid warning against inbreeding. Modern genetic analysis of their portraits shows a visible progression of their facial deformities correlating precisely with their inbreeding coefficient, a biological horror story written across generations of royal faces. Today, the skeletal remains of the Habsburgs continue to be studied by geneticists seeking to understand rare diseases. Charles II's genetic legacy lives on not through descendants, but as a case study in medical textbooks, the human equivalent of a laboratory experiment gone horribly wrong. The next time you see a royal wedding celebrated with pageantry and romance, remember the dark genetic secrets that once lurked behind those crowns. The Habsburg jaw stands as history's most visible reminder that even the most powerful families on earth cannot defy the laws of biology.